Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So now we've covered demand. Next thing we want to do is build supply. Remember, these are the component parts of a market. So to supply something simply means to make a good or service available for purchase. Another way to say that is just to sell it, right? So you might even say the word suppliers, right? Suppliers and sellers, synonyms. So suppose that you're selling your car. What's the first thing you're going to think of? If you watched the previous video, you know what I'm going to say. The answer is price, right? I mean, it's even more clear, I think, if you're selling something, that what you really care about is the price that you're going to get for it. I have, back in graduate school, I had a motorcycle. Wasn't really anything special. It was a nice motorcycle. But then my wife and I started having kids. One of the things that's unfortunate about motorcycles is they're a little bit dangerous. Wasn't too keen on making my children fatherless, so I ended up selling the motorcycle. But the cool thing about my motorcycle, I was at the University of Oklahoma working on my PhD. Those of you that watch any kind of college football know that there's kind of a rabid fan base of Oklahoma Sooners fans. And I had a very nice custom paint job on the motorcycle that's been done by my brother-in-law, who did some painting. So I knew that it had a little bit extra value, right? So when I went to sell it, I knew what the market value of the thing was. Right, motorcycles aren't particularly expensive. It was probably something like $1,000. I posted it in order to sell it, and I posted it at $1,500. When I went to sell the motorcycle, a gentleman showed up, right, and his friend dropped him off. Now, the thing about motorcycles is their engines are sensitive to not being run, and they're also not great to drive in the middle of winter, even in a relatively mild climate like Oklahoma. So I hadn't driven the thing in a while. It was running good the previous summer, but I was selling it in the early spring, which is, of course, a good time to sell motorcycles. Why? Because one of the things we could have included as a determinant for demand is seasonality, right? What's the demand going to look like for ice cream in January as compared to the ice cream demand in June? That can be neatly folded into taste and preferences, I think, as well, which is why you could actually make a almost infinite list of determinants for demand and probably as well for supply. So we've limited here in this class to the ones that we want to focus on, the big and the important ones, the common ones, as it were. However, there's a problem, right? If you have your friend drop you off when you go to purchase a car that you haven't yet agreed to buy, it's a pretty strong signal. So I knew as the seller in that case, this person was pretty committed to buying the motorcycle. And he did the reasonable thing, said, can I start it up and run it? And it would start, ran pretty nice, but hadn't been run all winter long. And so when he went to put it in gear, it would end up dying. So I knew I got to knock something off of the price here, and I started the negotiating. I ended up, I forget the exact numbers, but knocking it down to $1,200 or something, right? So this is just an idea of how supply and demand might interact in a particular situation. We could think of a bunch of different examples. In the same way that we can do a demand schedule, we can do a supply schedule. So let's say that you have a friend and he's selling cars, and so you observe how many cars does he make available at each individual price. So suppose the price is $2,000. It's not particularly high for a car, and he ends up making 3 available. What if the price rises to $4,000? More people want cars. Maybe there's lots of reasons for that, right? And he then makes 6 available. The price goes up to $6,000. You guessed it. It goes up to 9. So there's a supply schedule for selling cars. We're selling cars here, and we try to always make sure that this is nice and clear. We did our demand curves in blue. That's kind of the textbook Econ 101 textbook thing to do. We knew that that was downward sloping, and for the sake of time here, I'm going to kind of jump ahead, but suppose that you've then got $2,000 per car. You're going to sell 3. That looks something like that. 4,000. Again, I'm going to do this quickly because we've seen this before. If it's 6,000, your friend is going to sell 9. That gives us this upward sloping supply curve. Okay. So remember, supply is the relationship between price and quantity for sellers. price and quantity for sellers. So in the same way that demand is the relationship between price and quantity for consumers, supply is the relationship for price and quantity for sellers. Make a little room here so that looks good in your notes. That gives us an idea of what the relationship looks like. That is to say, the same intuition that we had before. If the price of something rises, you were less likely to buy it. If the price of something rises, you're more likely to sell it. Okay, so that's what I mean by the relationship between price and quantity. In fact, let's go ahead and write that down because that's always good to have, right? Price rises, more likely to sell. We talked about that availability idea in the ideas lecture. Price rises, more likely to sell. Okay, so in the same way that we had determinants, we have that supply curve, it's a relationship between price and quantity. Same way that we had determinants for demand, we've got determinants for supply. The most important one is going to be input costs, right? And the nice thing about supply is you have this extra way, maybe even more clear than with demand, of how to think about it. If something's going to reduce the profitability of selling something, you're less likely to sell it. If it's going to increase the profitability of selling something, you're more likely to make it available. So supply is going to follow that basic rule. The most important thing is what we call input costs, right? Or factors of production. Now this can range very widely in terms of what these actually are, right? My favorite example is I want to open an artisan peanut butter and jelly shop in New York City, right? So what are the factors of production? Well, one of the factors of production is going to be the storefront. One of them is going to be the employees. One of them is going to be the capital, right? I got to have a cash register. I got to have probably freezers, refrigerators, etc. And so those are all cost of factors of production. So if your input costs go up, that reduces your profitability, supply goes down. So let's take a look at what that would look like. We've got our supply curve. It's upward sloping, meaning that when price goes up, we want to make something more available. Now, there's a little bit of a problem. I've already mentioned Alfred Marshall once before in this class, but I'll call this Marshall's mistake. Marshall's mistake is that initially, ironic that I would typo as mistake, Marshall's mistake was that he initially thought that quantity drove price and not that price drove quantity. What that means is our axes, very much like the nodes on a battery, right? You have positive and negative. Electricity flows negative to positive. That's the same type of mistake that economists made early on. And the notation has just become so entrenched that we kind of can't undo it. And so really, ideally, you'd have, remember that this is an axis that you're seeing here, right? And just like your 6th grade math, when you did the Cartesian coordinate system, right, you'll note that the price is on the y-axis, and that's the dependent variable, and quantity is on the x-axis. That should be the independent variable. But as we see, it's actually quantity is dependent on price, not the reverse. So we actually kind of have backwards graph here. So bear with me on that. So we got Marshall's mistake to deal with here. The reason that I'm bringing that up is because supply going down, like we're doing here, means supply shifting left, which is going to look kind of weird because when we go to graph it, it kind of looks like it's higher, but it's actually leftward. And I'll show you how it is that that makes sense. So input cost goes up. I think we were selling cars, right? So we're selling cars, and the cost of the cars that the dealers are sending to your dealership has gone up, and so you're having to deal with that. Well, if you had this price and you were initially willing to sell this many cars, so we could actually pull these from the other one, right? So suppose that this is the $2,000 price, and that made you willing to sell 3 cars. You can see I got that from supply schedule 1 here. Then if we're now having higher input costs, we're willing to sell less. That means at 2,000, we might only be willing to sell maybe 1 car. So you can see how that's a supply decrease. Okay, so input costs go up, supply goes down. Okay, the next thing that we want to talk about is technology. So when technology increases, that's an increase in the efficiency of production typically. Efficiency of production. So it's sort of a cost decrease in disguise. If technology of production increases, it's going to increase your supply. Pretty straightforward. Next idea we have is taxes and subsidies. Now, these are going to work. I put them together as one because they're related, and they're sort of going to work in opposite directions. So if you put a tax on something, you raise the taxes on it, right? That's going to impact your supplier. Now, specifically, we could have put taxes actually on the demand side as well. In future econ classes, if you get to taking applied microeconomic classes, that might be something that you end up doing. For the sake of this class for now, we're going to think about taxes being placed on the supplier since it's a little bit more common. If the tax of something goes up, then the profitability of providing that particular good goes down. So this is one of those like fundamental economic insights that you need to take note of. When you put a tax on something, you typically get less of it. This is why economists, question the wisdom of putting income taxes, right? So income is the payment to work. If you get less of that, if you get less of the benefit to that, you will get less of the, in this case, desirable good of work, right? So increase income tax, you'll get less work. Okay. And then subsidies. If you subsidize something, that means you give suppliers a certain amount per unit that they produce, or however you arrange that. That increases the profitability of it. That will get you an increase in supply. So just like with demand, number of sellers also impacts supply. The number of sellers goes up, the amount that you're selling will become available. Very straightforward, I think. So the last one, and the one that you would expect, right, is expectations of future prices. There's no income in this case, so we're just focused on the prices. What happens if you're a seller and you have something for sale and you expect that the price will go up? Well, your supply now, remember that's the supply now, so in the future I think the price will be higher, then I'm going to hold on to my reserve so I can sell it when it's at a higher price in the future. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned in passing in demand section that I want to hammer a little bit more now is to remember that all these things, all the determinants, supply and demand both, are symmetric. That means if number of sellers goes up, supply goes up. That also means if number of sellers goes down, supply will go down. Okay, so I want to finish off with the same question that we had before because it's just as applicable here. Would a change in price cause supply to shift? The answer is no. Remember that in the same way that demand is the relationship between price and quantity, supply is the relationship between price and quantity. So I'll spare you the graph this time. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put supply and demand together. That's going to get us equilibrium, and we'll talk about how markets function.